Shockoe Bottom, along the James River, is one of Richmond, Virginia's oldest neighborhoods. It also lays claim to its darkest past. From 1830 to 1865, it served as one of the largest slave trading hubs in the South, second only to New Orleans. Over 300,000 people passed through here during a life in bondage. Virginia Delegate Dolores McQuinn has been working to memorialize the pathway they walked through the port, where the atrocities of enslavement were hidden away from polite society.
My first walk on the slave trail, I began to cry what people who lived at a different era, but I was connected to by DNA, had to live through.
The area contained numerous slave jails, holding pens for those waiting to be auctioned or carried away by their new owners. While the conditions in the jails were harsh, none compared to Lumpkins Jail, also known as the Devils Half-Acre. Run by Robert Lumpkin, it was the jail where slave owners brought so-called disobedient or troublesome slaves to break them through whatever brutal means necessary.
Based on what I have read, Robert Lumpkin was a mean man. Robert Lumpkins was an evil person.
The slaves were crammed into small cells, shackled and covered in filth and stench, with no toilet or facilities and little food or water. Some were beaten. It was especially torturous for slaves whose owners felt they needed to be punished. An 1856 biography of a runaway slave, Anthony Burns, describes his time at Lumpkins.
He cooped him up in the loft of the jail, where the air was stale, where he was shackled. It was filthy. He was given a starvation diet. He only got into the open air once in a while to show him to people, to humiliate him. He was there for 8 months.
In the end, though, Lumpkins Jail would no longer be a gateway into humiliation and slavery, but one where Black Americans would have access to a brighter future. It was after the Civil War. The newly ratified 13th Amendment ensured freedom to some 4 million enslaved people. At the forefront were abolitionists, many of whom were Christians, committed to living out the teachings of Jesus Christ.
They took the gospel seriously and said, Christ will make you free, and that stands for everybody. These people do deserve not just freedom, but they deserve equality.
And many believed equality would come through education. Generations of slaves had been forbidden to learn how to read or write.
Education immediately becomes a threat to the hierarchy. Enlightenment becomes a threat, because if I can keep you ignorant, I can keep you in your place.
While many started a campaign to provide the basics, other groups, such as the American Baptist Home Mission Society, had an even loftier vision: to empower Black Americans to become leaders in society, especially in churches, through higher education.
Most people thought, okay, vocational education was okay, but the idea of training these newly freed people to be college professors, to be ministers, to head up seminaries, that was pretty radical.
And dangerous. As schools began cropping up, teachers and students experienced violence. Some schools were burned or vandalized. Still, they were not alone.
Christians who had a heart for these people who had suffered were willing to suffer alongside.
One of them was a 70-year-old Baptist minister named Dr. Nathaniel Colbert. Sent by the American Baptist Home Mission Society, he came to Richmond in 1867 looking for a place to start a Black seminary. Finding a city tattered from the war, there were few options.
30 blocks of Richmond had been destroyed, and most of what was left was in the hands of white Southerners who were unsympathetic, to say the least. Dr. Colbert apparently was preying on it a lot, and he met a group of congregants outside First African Baptist Church, told him of his plight, and a tall, fair-faced woman said that she had a place that he could rent very cheaply.
Her name? Mary Ann Lumpkin, former slave and widow of notorious slave jailer Robert Lumpkin. She was around 8 years old when Lumpkin bought her, and she would bear him 5 children in their 25 years together before he legally married her at the end of the war.
She was in a constant mode of surviving. There was no power of her own, but she survived it.
When Robert died in 1866, he left everything to Mary, including his infamous jail in Shockoe Bottom.
That quickly turned to the idea of turning good into evil, turning the Devils Half-Acre into what was rechristened by Dr. Colbert, God's Half-Acre.
In its 3 years there, the school, known then as the Culver Institute, would graduate some 200 students, young men born into slavery, seizing a more hopeful future for themselves.
Authentic education thrusts you and calls you to a commitment to freedom and justice.
It's with that commitment the school moved forward into the future. It joined with another black seminary to form Virginia Union University in 1899, not far from Lumpkins Jail. More than a century later, Virginia Union still stands, maintaining its tradition of excellence while bringing up generations of leaders to continue the fight for equality for all Americans. As for Lumpkins Jail, it was torn down in 1888, and its painful history was almost lost until activists and archaeologists excavated it in 2008. Delegate McQuinn is part of an effort to build a museum on the site.
You talk about the journey of African Americans in America. Many say, well, this is African American history, but this is Americans' history. We've got to tell the truth.
Just as people of faith stepped in to address the evils of slavery, Dr. Kinney says Christians today must continue that legacy, reaching out with the love of Christ to end racism.
I will put my life, my status, and my privilege at risk for the truth that I recognize in God and the principles of the land I love. That's for this nation to be healed.